So I'm going to jump back into my ball project, my bouncing ball. I still got a little work to do with the path to iron out some of the kinks of the path, but I could do that. I'll do that later. What I really want to do right now is just kind of get that squash and stretch in place. And so the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to introduce a squash and stretch. I'm going to make it a child of the sphere. With the squash and stretch selected, I'm going to zero out the position coordinates. So I only had to change the Y in this case. I'll choose apply, and at that point that aligns the squash and stretch exactly where I want it. Now I'm going to go back to the sphere, just like I did in the previous demonstration. I'm going to double the segmentation. It's not really necessary in this case with this model, but I think it's a good practice to be tuned into the fact that when you add deformation, you have a lot more control over the kinds of deformation and the smoothness of it if you have more segmentation. But of course there's a price to pay, because the more geometry you have in a model, the longer that the render time is going to take. So now I want to start to play around with the squash and stretch. Okay, the squash and stretch is a child of the child of the ball, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to borrow the existing keyframes that I have. Okay, with the ball selected or the sphere selected, I have a keyframe at 0, 10, 20, and 30. Now whether that's 30, 60, 90 according to your scenario, it doesn't really matter. But what I want to do is I want to borrow, or not borrow, but I want to sync up the keyframes here so that as the ball or the sphere is impacting with the ground, the squash and stretch is being applied. Now there's going to be more keyframes with the squash and stretch than there is with the ball, just based on having to control the squash and stretch, and we'll see about that in just a minute. So now if I'm thinking ahead, the very first keyframe, very quickly I'll realize that I need to preserve the factor of the squash and stretch before the animation starts. Now what I mean by that, and I'll just ignore that point here for a second, I'm going to advance the playhead to frame 10. I'm going to select the squash and stretch, and this is the point where I want the ball to really kind of squish into the ground. I'm going to go find the factor attribute for the squash and stretch, and I'll just reduce the factor a bit. Okay? And I'll just make a mental note that I'm squashing it down to say, oh, we'll exaggerate here. That's a little too much. Let's say like 65%. Okay? And I'll just make a mental note that I'm squashing it 65%. I'll change that here in just a minute, but I do want to record that keyframe for the factor. Now, remember, there's a couple of different ways to do this. I can right-click or control-click on the factor bullet, choose animation, add keyframe. That's kind of the long way. I'll Command-Z to undo that. Alternatively, I could hold down the control key and click on that bullet, and that automatically adds a keyframe. Now, that's going to be my preferred method, is control-click on this to add the keyframe, and watch what happens when I rewind the playhead. When I move that playhead backwards, that squash and stretch is still applied, okay, because that's the original position, that's the only keyframe that we set. So I'm going to have to work backwards here. I'm going to move the ball back to the beginning, and I need to reset the factor here. So I'm going to bump that up to roughly 100%. If I'm a little over, that's okay. I'm not too concerned. I'll click on the bullet for factor, and that marks the keyframe. And so now what happens is I got a little bit of a glitch still in my animation, okay, because what does Cinema 4D do? It causes these two keyframes to even out over time. So that squash and stretch, if I scrub the playhead and pay attention to what's going on in the factor here, over the course of time, that ball is starting to squash down. So I got a little problem with my physics, the believability here. So I got a little bit of an issue. So what I'll do is that we'll say frame 10 is roughly when the ball is impacting with the ground. If I back that frame off just a bit, what I'll do is I'll also go back to the factor, and I'll bump that up to roughly 100%, get it pretty close, and I'll control click, and I'll mark that keyframe. Now what I've done is I have one keyframe where the factor of the squash and stretch is at 0. I have a second keyframe that preserves the factor of the squash and stretch between frame 0 and 9. So the ball does not change its position. From 9 and 10 it squishes down. Okay. And then as it bounces back up, we want to go back and change that factor once again. So just on the other side of where the ball is impacting and bouncing off the ground, in my case, it's at frame 11. I'm going to increase the factor. And I might even go back a little bit beyond 100%. So I want to exaggerate that squash. I want it to actually stretch on the other side of the bounce. And I'll just control click. Try that again, control click to mark that keyframe. And now the result that I get looks something like this. Okay? And I'll just keep kind of feeling my way through this. And I'll make a note along the way. I'm going to select the sphere and just kind of figure out where the keyframes are. And I'm really going to try to match that up so that I don't have keyframes just kind of randomly distributed through space. And I'll go back to the squash and stretch. I'll reduce that factor down to 100, roughly 100%. And I'll mark that factor again, and now I'll just keep scrubbing the play and see what I got. So now as the squash and stretch happens, you can see that we're really exaggerating the ball impacting with the surface here. And once we play that in full motion, I'll rewind and play. We can get a sense of what that looks like. Okay, so I got a little bit of weirdness going on still with my animation path. The animation is actually happening a little too fast. And so if you remember from the previous demonstration, in order to solve that, I'll go to Window, Timeline, and I'm going to redistribute all of the keyframes. For now, I have the sphere, and the sphere also has a child of the squash and stretch. So there's several animations going on here. So I'll use this little dolly icon to click and drag and zoom in. I'll pan the timeline. And what I'll do is I'll select the summary, and that selects all the animation. I'm just going to zoom out a little more, and I'll redistribute this over the course of 60 frames. Now, I've redistributed that over the course of 60 frames, but we still have a little glitch in that our timeline is set from frame 0 to frame 30, which means that we don't have 60 frames in our animation. So if I rewind and I hit play, I'm only going to see half of my animation. Okay, so even though I was able to extend in the timeline the animation beyond frame 30, Cinema 4D is only being told to play frames 0 to 30. So I'll fix that real quick by saying frames, by keying in 60 here as the end frame, and now I'll hit rewind and I'll hit play, and that animation feels a little better. I still got a glitch towards the end, but again, I'm going to work out those details offline. So when it comes to the animation, there's going to be both an art and a science to this. And I'm looking at all 60 frames right now, and at this point, when I'm factoring in several different keyframes, some of them are synchronized with the actual sphere. And others are, in the case of preserving the squash and stretch, we got a couple additional keyframes. At this point, it might start to make sense to changing the viewport now and then to the animation view, so we get a better sense of what our keyframes are, or staying in the standard view and choosing Window, Timeline. I'll jump back and forth between the two methods. Keep in mind, in the timeline, you can pan the timeline just like you do in the 3D space. As we discussed in previous demonstrations, you can also dolly in and out of the timeline. So we'll take a deeper dive into the timeline over the course of this semester. But experiment with the squash and stretch. I'm going to continue to push this forward in terms of production. Don't be afraid to add several more bounces into the equation. I'm actually going to back up and start my whole animation over. I'm also going to do it in a way that I'm going to stage this environment so that I'm really kind of thinking about the lights. I'm thinking about the environment. So it's not just simply a ball bouncing in the vacuum of space. I'll really kind of consider my environment and some of the things that we talk about in the 3D design class. So one last glitch that I'm going to fix before I pause this presentation, and that is I'm certain that my sphere is not actually impacting with the ground. If I look at this from a flat view, I got a little bit of a glitch, flatten out the view. My sphere is not quite impacting with the ground. It probably was at one point, but the way that we started to squash this thing, it just isn't making any sense. And so I'm going to do two things. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the squash and stretch, and I'm going to play around with the distribution of this center on the squash and stretch. And so if I increase the center, it flattens out the top. If I decrease the center, it flattens out the bottom. And I'll use that just to kind of flatten out that bottom a little bit. And instead of moving my sphere, my animated sphere, instead of moving that down, I'm just going to take the cube, which is acting as my floor plane. I'm going to take that, I'm going to cheat it, and I'll just move it up a little bit so that it looks like the sphere is actually touching the ground. There we go. Because that cube is not moving anywhere, I can cheat it like that and just pick it up a little bit. And now, once I get some lights in the equation and start casting a shadow, I won't get that'll look a little bit more believable. So that's the basic concept of squash and stretch. There's a lot of exaggeration here in terms of the way that I've animated the bouncing ball. And we really want to exaggerate some of our motion, because once this thing starts really kind of speeding through time, we really want to hit the user or the viewer over the head with some of the effects that we apply. So a little squash and stretch, a little exaggeration, a couple of the principles of animation, and we'll continue to explore some of those as we push the ball forward. So we'll catch up in the next presentation.